Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 127. We are long overdue for a listener Q&A, so today I'm actually going to cover some topics that were brought up in questions from our audience. I'm going to cover everything from training planning to how you deal with stiffness, which has a bad connotation, but actually can be really, really advantageous from an athletic standpoint. And we're also going to dig a little bit on the topics of recovery and work capacity and all that fun stuff. So hopefully there's something in here for everybody, whether you're a coach, a player, a parent, or someone else in the sports medicine or strength and conditioning community. Really enjoy doing these, and by all means, keep coming with the questions because they always create some good food for thought. Overuse injuries have emerged as one of the biggest threats to players at every level of competition. As an example, at the professional level, ulnar collateral ligament injuries at the elbow alone sideline pitchers for an average of over 17 months. That's a ton of lost development and a threat to lengthy careers. Just as concerningly, though, for youth players, overuse is the predominant mechanism of injury. So what can be done? Obviously, we need to train athletes to be prepared for all the stresses the game throws at them. However, the other side of the equation, recovery, often doesn't get the attention it deserves. Healthy, recovered arms mean you can stay in the game and give your best on the field, and that's where Mark Pro comes in. Mark Pro is a cutting-edge recovery tool that provides all the benefits of active recovery, but without the extra effort, muscular fatigue, or stress to tendons and joints. Players can use Mark Pro as long as needed for exceptional recovery between training sessions or after games. We'll often send Mark Pro units back with athletes to their hotels or even have them use them on team flights. Both easy to use and portable, Mark Pro is a powerful tool that allows recovery anywhere, anytime. Use it while relaxing at home, on the road, or during tournaments. On a personal note, I was originally a naysayer when it came to Mark Pro. However, longtime Cressey sports performance athlete Corey Kluber turned me on to it. He adopted Mark Pro into his post-pitching recovery approach, and it was an integral part of him going out and throwing 200 innings year after year. This led me to experiment with it myself and with more of our athletes, and the feedback was consistently outstanding. Now, just a few years later, you'll see it in every major league organization as part of the routines of some of the most accomplished baseball players on the planet. If you're looking for the same results enjoyed by these athletes, visit markpro.com and use the coupon code Cressey at checkout for an exclusive discount. Again, that's markpro.com, markpro.com, and use the coupon code Cressey, Cressey, at checkout for an exclusive discount. All right, we're going to get going with this month's Q&A, and I think this first question is an awesome one, so I want to get right to it. One of our listeners asked, I heard a while back that you mentioned that you'd rather have an athlete be too tight than to have him be too loose. Can you please explain why? I think it's an awesome question, something that is really underappreciated. Just because I think in general we heard the word tight, we always think that there's bad outcomes that come from that. In reality, some of the most athletic athletes that we'll see on the planet are actually very, very tight. Most of the elite sprinters, running backs have super tight hamstrings. We should understand why that's the case, whether it's actually a favorable adaptation, unfavorable adaptation, and really we need to peel back the layers on an onion on why we want someone to be too tight as compared to too loose. Obviously, I think in an ideal world, we prefer to have them be somewhere in the middle. If you're in the middle of the road, you probably draw the benefits of this passive stability that ligamentous structures can really give you, but at the same time, you're not so tight that you run the risk of muscles being fundamentally short and really prone to strain. So as I think about kind of these two ends of the spectrum, though, looser jointed folks, hypermobile folks, can be more challenging to deal with for a number of different reasons. So I'll go through them kind of one by one. The first thing I'd say is that assessments of hypermobile individuals can be challenging because they can often make bad movement look good unless you really, really scrutinize what's right in front of you. And I think we also know that assessments are inherently biased towards favorable outcomes for people who are hypermobile. A lot of the assessment components are based on range of motion. In reality, they can cheat a lot of these tests. They do really, really well without actually having to try. When it comes to making bad movement look good, one of the things you might see is take a toe touch, for example. You'll see a hypermobile individual go palms flat on the floor with absolutely no posterior weight shift. Their hips won't budge. Instead, they'll just hyperextend their knees and work through a freaky flexible spine. So, from the outside, they accomplish the task, but the motion isn't coming uniformly from a number of different joints. Instead, they're just kind of selling out for it at one specific joint. The second thing that I think makes hypermobile athletes and more loose jointed athletes a little bit more challenging is that symptoms seem to move around a lot when they are having some kind of an injury or condition. And this is often the case because they find new ways to compensate and effectively sell out for excessive range of motion at multiple joints. Using the example of the toe touch, we talked about knee hyperextension, we talked about freaky spine flexibility, whatever it may be. And I think this is one of the reasons why, in the general population in particular, so many of the fibromyalgia and chronic pain cases we see occur in people who are hypermobile. Very rarely do you see people that just wake up and they have 8 different joints that all hurt at once. In reality, maybe it's a left wrist, and then it becomes a left shoulder, and then it becomes the neck, and then it's the opposite shoulder, and it works its way around. And certainly we know that there is likely an association between joint hypermobility and anxiety/panic attacks, presumably because the sympathetic nervous system is going to be hardwired to fire on all cylinders to both create joint stability, to actually get muscular recruitment to stabilize those joints, but also to stimulate folks and make them kind of foot tappers and people who are kind of chronically under stress. So, we've talked in previous podcasts about the need for helping these individuals get better sleep quality and all that. But just in general, symptoms can move around a lot. People can present uniquely each different day when they are hypermobile, just because they'll throw stress in different places because they have so much motion to control. A third thing that I think is really important just on the trainability side of things is that it takes time to add good stiffness to a system, and you need to be really, really consistent with it. So we often see with folks who are really hypermobile is you turn around for a second and they're stretching aggressively, they're creating more unrestrained range of motion. Stiffness is something that we have to give reminders to the system. So folks have to stay away from things that make them more loose jointed and instead add more motor control to the system. So if you really have to stay on top of people to not slip into bad patterns, it becomes very, very challenging. It's almost like a babysitting type of workout as opposed to just training program. And I think beyond that too is they can generally get into much worse positions when they are out of alignment. So, we talk about not wanting to drive your car when it's out of alignment. And if you do that when you're already unstable, you'd be just creating an even higher level of instability. It becomes pathological. A fourth thing, I think is really tricky is, if we talk about someone who is too loose, let's say they get really, really far down the rabbit hole and it's something that requires a surgical intervention, more than likely that surgical intervention is going to involve a repair, right? It's going to be a repair to a torn capsule or a torn labrum, a rotator cuff or something like that, something to give them some semblance of stability to a joint that has lost it. And that's a big deal because when you talk about doing a repair, you have to really take into account the biologics of healing and not pushing folks too soon after surgery. It's a much longer timeline. And we'll talk about why that's a little bit different than a tighter athlete. But if we look at this, in summation, hypermobile individuals are harder to assess. They're generally harder to diagnose because symptoms can move around. They can be harder to train just because you need such frequent interactions with them to create good motor control. And they likely adapt slower just because there is more range of motion that has to be controlled. And on top of that, they have some systemic things, probably anxiety, poor sleep quality, low blood pressure, things like that may actually, interfere with their ability to favorably adapt. And just if these things aren't all, hard enough to deal with, if they don't respond well to this conservative treatment, they're often surgical cases that involve a repair, which is a longer timeline than just a removal, which we'll talk about. So lots of different things working against them. Now, conversely, if we're talking about a stiffer athlete, they tend to be a lot easier to manage across these fronts. So if we're talking about assessments, range of motion numbers tell a much bigger story. They're very easy objective measures to track, both over, weeks and months, or even in just an individual session. If someone comes in with 10 degrees of hip internal rotation and I do some positional breathing or some manual therapy or some kind of mobilization, and all of a sudden they've got 25 degrees and all of a sudden that hip feels so much better, we know that we're barking up the right tree. We get that instantaneous feedback, and short and longer term feedback from stiffer athletes as they regain motion. Second, compensatory patterns are easier to spot in stiff individuals. So if a joint is really stiff, it stops moving. Either it hurts because you're banging into a bony block or some kind of limitation to range of motion, or you'll see that athlete go to an adjacent joint to get that motion. So if we're looking at someone who's got very limited hip extension, Their Thomas test is brutal, and we put them on the table in prone, and we have them do a prone hip extension. If they can't extend their hip, we're probably going to see a lot of arching through the low back. So their lack of hip extension becomes QL tightness, or gliding forward in the joint that irritates the front of the hip. So we can generally see things from a compensatory standpoint that we might not be able to see as easily in really hypermobile individual. Third, and this is one that I think is really important to appreciate, is that range of motion isn't always a good predictor of injury. There certainly are studies, limited shoulder flexion seems to relate to increased risk of elbow injuries in throwers, but range of motion isn't always a good predictor of injury. I'm always surprised that some of these really, really stiff athletes manage to basically stay healthy when you don't expect them to. However, if you look at the research, weakness almost always is because of the role of fatigue, right? So weakness predicts injury because strength is a foundation for strength endurance. It's a foundation for power. It's a foundation for, agility measures. And it's certainly a foundation for having motor control at a joint. So if we talk about a baseball pitcher that is very hypermobile and they don't have enough strength, eventually all that stress is going to go from the active restraints, the scapular stabilizers, the rotator cuff, and it's going to be put on the passive restraints, the ligament structures, the capsule at the shoulder. So having some stiffness kind of protects us in the face of fatigue. And I think that's a vitally important consideration to work with. A baseline level of stiffness provides a level of strength from the passive restraints, so you get some assistance. Fourth, I think we really have to appreciate that sometimes the most athletic folks that we have do have a lot of stiffness. They have tightness that makes them a little bit more springy. And Greg Rose at Titleist Performance Institute and On Base U, one of our previous podcast guests, when we talked to him about kind of developing youth athletes, one of the comments he made was that the adolescent growth spurt is a great time to train power, right? Because they're wound so tight. It's a perfect opportunity to have some really, really good output that can create some favorable adaptations in the neuromuscular system. So I don't think we need to vilify tight from a performance standpoint. Sometimes it makes folks really, really athletic, as long as they have the right amount of good stiffness at adjacent joints to make it work. A fifth point that I would say with these stiffer individuals is recognize that you have a lot of interventions in your back pocket because an athlete can be tight for a number of reasons, right? They might be tight because of true muscular shortness. Maybe that's a scenario where they were, had an elbow surgery and they were, put in a situation where they were stuck in flexion for a period of time, and they actually fundamentally lost some of the, sarcomere, some of the functional unit of skeletal muscle, and have to do some longer duration, lower load stretching to get that back. We may see some people that have protective tension, right? So this is the athlete who has crazy anterior pelvic tilt. So their hamstrings are firing on all cylinders to hold them in some semblance of posterior pelvic tilt. We may see neural tension, someone who throws out a disc in their spine and all of a sudden they've got tightness into their legs. We may see an individual who pulls a hamstring and lays down, kind of gritty, fibrotic, nastic tissue where there's, the tissue just doesn't deform the way that it should, so it feels tight. We can see people who have protective spasm. So you throw out your back and there's an acute kind of lockdown component to it where you're not going to allow, potentially harmful range of motion to take place. Then you have, certainly osseous restrictions. Maybe you have a bony block in your elbow that feels tight on the underside because you have a spur that's blocking your ability to extend your elbow. Certainly being out of alignment, we talk a lot about posture restoration, and you'll see folks that, are very, very stuck in their right hip. So, like we talked about earlier, driving a car that's out of alignment can create instability, but along that path, you can feel a level of tightness. And then certainly last but not least, you may feel tight because you have a lack of good stiffness at an adjacent joint. This kind of goes hand in hand with the protective tension that I talked about, a little bit earlier. But what's cool about most of these is they actually don't require stretching to address, right? If we're talking about, protective tension, establish some stability in adjacent joints, neural tension, get that disc settled down, previous injury, soft tissue restrictions, manual therapy might be your best place to go first. Protective spasm, probably, medications, muscle relaxers, or some level of manual therapy interactions. If we're talking about an osseous restriction, a bony block, stretching that is not going to work particularly well. Like it's probably a surgical intervention. It's a removal of some sort. So all these things are potentially, handled. There's tightness that can go away without just stretching. And that stretching may actually be contraindicated for a number of the issues I just outlined. However, if we're talking about hypermobile individuals, they're not going to turn a corner that fast because you have to do some kind of repair if things are broken. We're talking about these stiffer individuals. In many cases, you can get a quick return on investment with positional breathing or manual therapy or even a surgical intervention to take that spur out. The return to action can be minutes, it can be weeks, it can be months, but it's probably not going to be a year and a half in many cases. And I know most surgical interventions typically involve a combination of repairs and removals, but I do always feel better about athletes when they've got a little bit of passive stiffness that they can fall back on. So just understand all these different factors from assessment to programming to how they present, to how they adapt, and certainly in worst case scenario, in a hypermobile individual, you're going to probably see a repair. In a really, really stiff individual, you might see more of a removal, and those timelines are markedly different. So those are the reasons I'd always love to see a little bit more stiffness than hypermobility. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rule, but just some generalized thoughts that I think will guide some of your thought processes as you manage the athletes that you interact with. Now, on to our second question. Is the high-low model useful for position players in season, or are there better strategies? This is another great question, and as always, the answer is that it depends. But the answer is also that the high-low model can work for everyone. It's just harder to implement in certain populations than others. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the high-low model was really popularized by Charlie Francis in the sprint community. This concept is really just about consolidating stressors, taking a lot of your CNS intensive output, heavy lifting, running fast, jumping high, trying to pair it into blocks throughout the week so that you have periods of very high stress and then low stress. And I think, using a baseball analogy, one of the things that drives me bonkers, and, we've talked about on a few previous podcasts, is this 5-day rotation in Major League Baseball, right? Where you pitch on day 0, and then day 1, they want to come in and crush a lower body lift. Day 2, it's, typically a bullpen and then run some gassers. Day 3 is an upper body lift. And then all of a sudden it's day 4 and you're just praying that you can, get yourself to, come out from underneath this crazy level of fatigue that you've imposed on yourself. So what we try to do with our athletes is create a day in the first day or two after an outing where it's just a straight up recovery day. And we do that by consolidating stressors. So in the example of somebody who throws a day 2 pen, we might have day 0 lift right after they come out of the game, and then a hard day 2, whereas day 1 is really, really low key, and they got 2 days on the back end to try to recharge. Or if it's a day 3 lift, we just train on day 3 pen, we'll do a training session on day 1 and day 3 and have day 2 off. So the point is that you're just really trying to find high points in the schedule and low points in the schedule so that we can basically manage stress and then, consolidate it so that folks, feel fresh when it's time to compete. And obviously the high-low model has a ton of merit in the pitching world because it's a more predictable routine as a starting pitcher. Position players and to some degree relievers are tougher to deal with because the gameplay is so frequent in baseball. Obviously 162 games in the major leagues blows any other professional sport out of the water. You'll see scenarios where teams may play, 30 games in 30 days, whatever it may be, particularly when you throw in, rainouts that create double headers and all that stuff. So the gameplay is incredibly frequent, but also the exertion level is unpredictable in those games. So as a hitter, you can go up and strike out 4 times and not have to run the bases at all. Or you could go up and you could have, 4 triples and log a ton of kind of yardage. Additionally, if you're in the first base dugout and you're playing left field, you're going to compile a lot more steps than the guy that just goes out to first base. So there's a lot of, kind of just actual, yardage covered for various athletes that differs widely. So you really have to, regardless of how you decide to approach this, be flexible, have the ability to pull back where it's appropriate. So on the amateur side, I think the high-low model actually works really, really well. All you're trying to do is consolidate stress into 24-hour blocks. It can be done easily in the high school and the college setting where they aren't playing every day. Most high school teams play 2 to 3 times a week. In the college setting, it could be upwards of 5 or 6, but typically there are a couple of days off during the week when athletes are on campus and at school. So what I try to do is I encourage people to find full days of rest to get their lows, and then just figure out how many highs you can have. Some of these younger athletes may be able to have 2 or even 3 of them to get their work in. But I think it's also really, really key to think about this concept of microdosing. Microdosing might be going out and running, 4 hard 10-yard sprints, or maybe it's coming in and just doing, A1, A2, like a set of rows and a set of front squats, and maybe doing 3 sets of each and just like calling it a session right there, just because it's such a quick exposure that it's not going to beat athletes up. We know in general volume, really, really beats athletes up a lot more than intensity in most cases. Obviously, the exception would be if you have really, really strong athletes that throw a lot of joint stress on by moving big boy weights. But I think microdosing is key because it allows you to gradually test the waters of how people do. Remember that sessions don't have to be long to be beneficial. You can go out and sprint post game. As a position player, if you didn't run a lot on the bases, going out and running like 2 or 3 really hard efforts can be great. You could do a 30-minute lift. Those things are very, very trainable, and they are convenient. But I think it's also really, really important to remember which qualities stick around the easiest. We know that aerobic fitness and maximal strength, you can probably train them once every 30 days and they're going to hang out. Whereas power tends to detrain the fastest. In my experience, it's power that works the best with the microdosing. So run a couple of hard sprints once or twice a week. Work a little bit of like kettlebell swing, something to like move weights fast into the weight room. And I think good things are going to happen. On your off days, do as little as possible. 2 days a week where you can, get just total deloads, I think is really, really helpful. That's a great day to push in some extra recovery modalities as well. But then, during the week, find 2 days where you feel like you can squeeze in a harder training session in alongside a game. So, this might be a college team playing Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and, they bang out a lift on Sunday so that Monday can be a low key day and they can fully recharge. And then, maybe they do another one on Wednesday or something like that just to consolidate it with a midweek game. The goal is always to try to, find some low key time. My experience has been that it often works really, really well on travel days. So what I'll often do with some of our amateur players that play in tournaments on weekends is we actually might lift like Monday through Thursday, with some fluctuations in that overall schedule. And then Friday is just a complete day of rest before, the weekend tournaments. And in many cases, like we can take a little bit of time off on Monday when they get back if they need to recharge as well. So, basically, the goal is just try to find some blocks where you can consolidate stress, and I think it works really well. Very hard to do at the major league level, just because the games take place every day, and similar to with relievers, you're better off almost just picking 2 days a week where you go and you really get it in, and then push hard for recovery stuff on the other days to work as much as you can, and then just systematically plan when guys have their off days over the course of the season. With all that said, you got to be flexible. In the amateur ranks, a coach might mix in a hard practice, or you might have to play an 18-inning game. You're going to need to be able to pivot on the fly, and it's important to appreciate that your training is there to support your competition, rather than just being something that's a standalone entity, right? Your training is there to keep you healthy and performing at a high level in the baseball world. So if you're emotionally attached to always getting in absolute savage training sessions, it's probably going to work against you in the long haul if you're really trying to be effective with this high-low model. So pick 2 good days a week where you can really get some quality work in, and then start microdosing just a little bit on the side. See if you can squeeze a little bit more volume and adaptations in without setting yourself back. Now, for our third question, someone asked, you spend a lot of time talking about training on the podcast, but what are your thoughts on recovery? Anything in particular that you're really high on right now? This is actually a great question, and something you're right, we haven't touched on in a crazy amount of detail. And I think it probably speaks to maybe a bigger methodology consideration. There are really 2 big schools of thought with respect to the whole, kind of looking at this bigger recovery initiative that's taking place across all levels of sports. The first side is that, we need to spend more time building a robust work capacity. We need to really prepare athletes so that any of the stressors that they encounter just aren't perceived as challenging. And there's also the school of thought, obviously, workload management, things like that. Particularly in the NBA, I think has gotten a lot of attention. The idea is, limit workload where appropriate, but also optimize recovery initiatives. And I really don't think at the big picture you have to you have to choose one or the other. And I certainly don't. But I do think we need to be very, very careful. I think as a whole in the industry, we've seen a lot of athletes turn into delicate little flowers, where they want their monitoring sister to do everything for them. They say, oh, my HRV scores aren't where they need to be. And, I really think I need to pull back. And some of the athletes that are the most drawn to this technology and this new level of awareness are the ones that really never understood how to work hard in the first place. And I think, when I look at the assessments that I do on a daily basis. It's 99% of athletes have something significant that they can work on in the context of either, work capacity or movement capacity. And if we really think about, how those two things are related, it's vitally important from a work capacity standpoint. If you don't have a base level of fitness, it's going to impact your movement capacity, right? If you have an athlete that does a set of 8 push-ups and the first couple look good, and then as they start to fatigue, they start to slip into lumbar extension and forward head posture and all these things we don't want. Clearly, fatigue, the lack of work capacity, has impacted their movement capacity. And they start shifting stress from active restraints to passive restraints. The movement becomes fundamentally more inefficient. And we've seen this, just some good research that came out in the recent past, just looking at how the medial elbow, how the joint gaps as the flexor tendon, becomes more and more fatigued over the course of a pitching outing. So the idea is that the flexor tendons, when they're strong and they have plenty of durability and kind of just endurance to them, that the elbow is not going to gap as much, and not as much stress is going to be thrown on the ulnar collateral ligament. So certainly there's implications in terms of how we train forearms and what we do at the shoulder to minimize the stress in that regard. But clearly work capacity there impacts movement capacity. The joint gaps more than it should because the tissues aren't prepared to handle a high volume of work. I think it goes the other way as well. There's situations where getting joints into the right position can improve fitness, which makes it easier for athletes to get into, to avoid going into some of these like heavily anaerobic environments. So, for me, before we even start talking about recovery or anything like that, we have to understand the psyche of the athlete. Are they just looking for ways to minimize their overall output? Are they people that have a lack of self-awareness on how much work they've actually put in to prepare themselves? What are the plays that take place? But we do know that a lack of work capacity, particularly in endurance sports, obviously you're going to see it more in soccer, things like that. They're huge players in injury risk. We need to work on in our training, creating an environment where athletes can do as much work as possible safely so that they have a good buffer against whatever they're going to encounter in competition. We have to monitor readiness and not push a crazy high volume on our athletes when they are fatigued. And we need to build this this high level of foundational preparation. So with all that said, what are the things that I think are vitally important? Well, first and foremost, nutrition and hydration. Again, some of this stuff that athletes claim that they have locked in, but in reality they generally don't. I think if you had to estimate the number of athletes that play 12 or 1 o'clock games in the amateur ranks who are dehydrated when they report to the field, it's probably 75% of athletes. We know that dehydration is one of the single most common causes of daytime fatigue and headaches and all those different things that can interfere with your ability to perform. So I think nutrition and hydration are huge. Most athletes come up short. That's why I've been a supporter of things that are, like Athletic Greens has been a sponsor of the show, and it's a plug here, but it's nutritional insurance for athletes who may have shortcomings, or they may not be eating the fruits and vegetables they need. Maybe they're eating poor quality foods, where they're they're on the road, and maybe things aren't quite as fresh, and they're not getting all the vitamins and minerals that they would have from that same food 20 years ago. So I think things like that can be really, really important, but you have to give athletes better preparation on nutrition and hydration before you start looking for more advanced strategies for recovery. Sleep quality is another one, particularly when we're talking about athletes that may be changing time zones, sleeping in hotels, sleeping on long bus rides, things along those lines. Preparing them for, making the room an absolute cave. Turn the air conditioning way up, make it as dark as possible, shut the cell phones off an hour before they go to sleep. All these different things can be really, really important. We know there's some amazing research out there that demonstrates that injury risk goes sky high when athletes are sleep deprived. They've done some studies on how injury risk changes during exam time for college athletes. So, I think that's, kind of like our big trio: nutrition, hydration, and sleep quality are some of our biggest, weapons in the battle to bounce back in a sport like baseball, where gameplay is on a really regular basis. Now, that said, if we want to go a little bit more down the sexy route, like Mark Pro is something I've obviously been very supportive of over the years. I like it because I'm a big fan of active recovery, when athletes have to go through basically anything that promotes blood flow, get the lymphatic system going, get the circulatory system going. There's probably some stimulatory effects to the endocrine system, helps with, how we we tolerate glucose and things like that. Mark Pro is nice because I joke it's passively active recovery, right? You can put on the pads and you can get a little thumping going through the muscles and get them moving while you're on a plane ride. We know athletes that will actually fall asleep with them sometimes at a lower setting. So I think it works really, really well with acute injuries and helping athletes bounce back. And more of our athletes are using that, as just a very easy way to get in some light active recovery. So I think, anything like Mark Pro can be really, really helpful. Building that out, I think, blood flow restricted training is something that's kind of caught the industry by storm and definitely has some merit. I used it a ton myself after my knee surgery. I think the recovery protocols can also be really, really good. I think some athletes probably overuse it a little bit. I've never been a big fan of really making athletes work hard for recovery. So, I've heard stories about, people, rocking them and doing the Versa Climber or something like that. I think you're better off on just the recovery setting if you are chasing recovery. Normatec, any kind of compressive garments seem to be helpful for a number of athletes, especially like compression socks when athletes fly, just to minimize any kind of swelling in that regard. And then certainly red light therapy is something that I think has gotten some good momentum on its side in the industry. Seems to have some pretty pronounced impacts on the endocrine system as well. So if you have the means to take advantage of some of these higher level options, those are probably my four: Mark Pro, BFR, Normatec, and red light therapy would be the ones that on top of nutrition, hydration, and sleep quality are probably going to be the biggest game changers for you. Again, with all that said, though, there's no substitute for building a great foundation of work capacity. The best recovery solution is to not develop a work capacity problem in the first place. So that kind of reflects some of my overall arching thoughts on all this stuff.